I'm Pat Young. I'm chairing this session. I'm a former Chief Creative Officer of the BBC, British-born of Barbadian parents. I'm now Barbados in the house. I'm looking for my fellow panelists. So if I call your name, they may be in the green room. Rod Little, there you are, Rod. Rosanna and Marchu. Come join us, come. How do you follow Ben Okri? That is our challenge. Okay. So, this session is on leaving no one behind, exploring exclusion in the Commonwealth. Two real foci. What is the lived experience of communities who face exclusion? And what institutional change is needed in the Commonwealth to ensure that exclusion is effectively challenged? Now, can I just add from the start that exclusion isn't just something that happens over there in the non-UK parts of the Commonwealth. I this morning signed a petition about the Windrush generation, my parents' generation, finding themselves at risk of being deported. So exclusion is real. It seems to be growing. And our work on inclusion, I think, has to be stepped up, and I think that's very much the measure of what Ben was saying earlier. So, on my panel today, I have three truth tellers. Rosanna Flamer Caldera, who fights for lesbian and gay, bisexual and trans rights in Sri Lanka. Rod Little, who works and campaigns for Indigenous people's rights in Australia. And Marchu Girma, who works with women seeking asylum in Britain. Unfortunately, Ofer Gutenbiel Liklikli from Tonga can't be with us today because of the impact of a cyclone. On my panel today, I have three truth tellers. Rosanna Flamer Caldera, who fights for lesbian and gay, bisexual and trans rights in Sri Lanka. Rod Little, who works and campaigns for Indigenous people's rights in Australia. And Marchu Girma, who works with women seeking asylum in Britain. Unfortunately, Ofer Gutenbiel Liklikli from Tonga can't be with us today because of the impact of a cyclone. Each panelist is going to talk to you. They're not going to make a speech. They're going to talk to you for 7 or 8 minutes about the lived experience of the campaigns that they are working on and the people that they represent. We will have a short discussion up here on the platform, and then we're going to throw the question in open to you in the room. And I just give you a warning now, in that inclusive spirit, when I ask for questions from the floor, if I don't see a hand, I will just point at someone and request a question. So you would be wise to listen up and have at least one question ready. Finally, at the end, Mr. G is going to come back and they're going to do a little bit more polling. So if we're good to go. Our first speaker, is Rosanna Flamer Caldera, an international LGBTIQ rights activist who's been a pioneer in pursuing and advocating for human and political rights for LGBTIQ people in Sri Lanka. Currently, she's the founder and director of Equal Ground, which focuses on sensitizing the mainstream to the issues and on the education, empowerment and community building of LGBTIQ people. Rosanna, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much for having me here. I know LGBTIQ is a mouthful. Sometimes people sort of look at you rather blankly. What are all those alphabet letters? But it's not that complicated. I come from an island called Sri Lanka, which is absolutely gorgeous. It's paradise, but not for the LGBTIQ community. For 135 years, we've been shackled with criminalization brought in by the British colonizers in 1883 and somehow embraced as our own by successive governments even after independence. Now, they say that this law is a benign law and that nobody is actually convicted of any crime post-independence, but that is really far from the truth. The fact that this law is here in Sri Lanka, the fact that LGBTIQ persons are, arbitrarily known as criminals in our country, makes them victims to all kinds of extortion, blackmail, rights violations, rape, arbitrary arrests, with no recourse to justice whatsoever. Now, this law is prevalent in most of the Commonwealth countries, and ours is a very unique country because in 1995, and please keep in mind that Sri Lanka is an extremely patriarchal country, which doesn't really have any recourse for women in general, decided in 1995 that our penal code was gender biased and therefore removed the word male from the text, making it illegal for lesbians as well. So we are one of those few countries that went backwards instead of going forwards in our quest for equal rights. Because this law is there, it is difficult for lesbians and gays and bisexuals, transgenders, and intersex persons in our country to actually live as citizens, contributing citizens of our country, because we have to look over our shoulders all the time. Not everybody can come out of the closet and say, I am gay, I am lesbian, and be okay with it. I have an amazing family that has accepted my sexuality from the time that I was a very young person. So I don't have to worry about what my family thinks of me. But most people in Sri Lanka do have to worry about what family thinks. Unfortunately, for many LGBT persons, family is a huge traumatic experience because of the kinds of situations that they're put into, where families don't accept them, where families shun them. A lot of them are thrown out of the house. Most lesbians, for example, are forced into heterosexual marriages and suffer a lifetime of sexual and mental abuse throughout their married life. They have no recourse to justice. They have no recourse to anything. The discrimination runs rife in business, in the workplace, healthcare, education. A lot of our LGBT kids are bullied in school, forced to, and bullied by not only their own peer students, but also by faculty members, teachers. They're forced to drop out of school, particularly transgenders, for example. That leads to a fact that they are uneducated or not educated enough for mainstream jobs. They're forced into sex work. They're forced to doing menial jobs. They're forced to move from job to job because they are harassed at the workplace. So there is an insurmountable amount of issues facing the LGBT community. Now, I know that people point to Colombo and say, oh, you guys have Colombo Pride, you have Pride celebrations in Sri Lanka. Yes, we do. But what it entails is making sure that every venue we choose, every event we have is in a safe space. We cannot march on the streets like in the UK, for example. We won't get permission, and B, there might be violence towards us. We have been threatened in the past by Sinhala Buddhist nationalists and Muslim extremists. So as an organization, we have gone through quite a bit of hardship to come to where we are at right now. And I must say that in the past 3 years, with the change in government, we've had a lot more freedom to actually engage with the government to try and get them to change things in Sri Lanka for our community. Decriminalization is a must. We cannot go forward unless that is in place. I see the way that my sisters and brothers in Sri Lanka face such insurmountable odds. And I think it's ironic. The other day I was just thinking about it. Our military, our armed forces that went through an incredibly violent and bloody war for 30 plus years, at least 10% of them are LGBT. They have given their lives for our country, but they're treated as criminals. They cannot be out and open about who they are. Why is that? I want to ask my government, what is it that prevents you from giving us our rights? We have people in our country that can contribute so much to the lived experience, to the economy of our country, to the diversity of our country, but yet we are shackled because politics shackles us. Politics is what keeps all of the minorities and all of the marginalized communities shackled because we don't apparently have as powerful a voice as we should. But I want to remind my government in particular, and they're going to hate me when I go home, that 10% at least of Sri Lanka identifies as LGBTIQ. That's over 2.2 million people. And if you take a country like India, for example, that is mind-boggling, the amount of people. So, you know, we are a lot of people, but we are treated as if we are invisible. We are treated as if we are some stain on society. And there are such issues that we face in our countries that a lot of our really bright and amazing individuals feel that they have to flee our country and go and live in other countries where they contribute so much to those countries instead of ours. So I really think that, you know, this idiom of, you know, cutting off your nose to spite your face applies most directly to the Sri Lankan government. So they need to get their act together. I think also there is an international responsibility in this as well. I know that I feel that countries doing business, trade with Sri Lanka, for example, should have a few boxes that need to be ticked, where international developmental aid, for example, or funding, has to have a caveat that says that if you receive our aid, you need to make sure that all the people of your country are protected and safeguarded, and that everybody has rights. They're human rights for everyone, not just a select few. Unfortunately, this doesn't always happen. We had a very saddening or depressing experience with the EU, for example. Sri Lanka was going for GSP+, and the EU assured us that decriminalization would be on the table. And after many, many months of lobbying the EU, we find that the agreement was signed and that decriminalization was taken off the table at the last minute. So we were thrown under the bus, unfortunately, and that doesn't sit well with us. So you will notice that this year, we at CHOGM, the LGBTIQ community has a large presence with the Commonwealth Equality Network. There's over 40 LGBTIQ activists from most of the Commonwealth countries in the Commonwealth. So we're here to tell you all, and we are here also to tell the British government that there has to be some responsibility taken for coming and landing us with laws that marginalize a certain section of the population for loving someone of their own sex. I think it's insidious to stop people from loving each other because some person might not think that that's the right thing to do. And I'm sure there are people here in the audience that, you know, probably disagree with me, but we're all humans at the end of the day. You cut us, and it's red blood that comes out, not green or blue. Thank you. And if we pride ourselves as human rights activists, and we come to forums like this, and we talk about our own, issues, if we don't acknowledge the elephant in the room, if we don't acknowledge that there are certain people that may be different. It may not be people who you are used to seeing or used to hanging out with, but nevertheless, they are people. And the LGBT community is the most amazing community. I'm proud to be a part of that community. I wouldn't have it any other way, really. So I'm here to say, accept everybody for who they are and make sure that you don't discriminate against somebody purely based on who they are or what they are. You know, yes?
Can I ask you what, I'm just going to ask you what 2 changes you would like to see?
Well, I had to write that one down, Pat? So I might have to read that a little bit. I think one of the changes we want to see with the LGBTIQ community across the Commonwealth, not just only in my country, because I speak with 2 hats here, is that we are afforded the same rights as everyone else, that decriminalization must take place across the Commonwealth, in all of the Commonwealth countries that still decriminalize homosexuality. I want to say that this Commonwealth Summit started off with a bang for us with Trinidad and Tobago decriminalizing. So well done, Trinidad and Tobago. So that's one of my asks, that decriminalization be taking place. And I think the Commonwealth needs to embrace diversity and equality, and that it should include all women, all marginalized communities, and countries must strive to stay true to the Commonwealth Charter that they signed on to. I think many people forget that this Commonwealth Charter has a very heavy emphasis on human rights. But a lot of our countries turn their back on human rights. So we need to emphasize that.
Okay. Thank you, Rosanna. The next speaker is Rod Little. Rod is from the Wiliang'u, Amangu and Wajik First Nations people of Western Australia. He's the co-chair of the National Congress of Australian First Peoples and has been a director with the Congress since 2010. In that role, he has advocated for the rights of Australia's First People at the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, contributed to the UN Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous People and the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination.
Thank you very much, Pat. First of all, can I acknowledge everyone and pay my respects to everyone in the room today, and thank you all for the opportunity for me to speak here today, the organisers. But I would also invite you to respectfully, lend your ears to me so that I can share my personal experience about exclusion. And I will begin telling the stories as my people have always told stories. I am number 3 of 11 children, my parents. And I have roughly about 13 grandchildren, would you believe?
Wow.
So I'm thinking about my experiences to get to thinking about the future of my children and my grandchildren. It's been so difficult, my experience, of not being recognised or valued in society as the First Peoples of Australia, and including in 1967, the 67 referendum actually wants to include the changes to the Australian Constitution to include Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to be counted in the census. So when I reflect on Ben's comments about that history, that is relatively new history. And for a Commonwealth nation, from my perspective, it's disgraceful to not be included from the very beginning. My people, my ancestors were the occupants of Australia before anyone else came there, and should be valued, should be the strength of the nation, because we are the heart of the nation. Notwithstanding the welcoming of new people to the nation and accepting people from different cultures and different backgrounds. But it's the constant exclusion that is disheartening, and the suffering of our people that is the real heart to the work that I do on behalf of my peoples. And that experience will go through from the time when I was at school, and I had a friend who could not speak English very well, so couldn't understand the instructions from the teacher. So I lent my support and tried to translate. And there are many in the room here that might recall the blackboards in the days of teaching, and you had the great big wooden rulers to be smacked around the head with that to say, "You little black person, you will never amount to anything. I don't know why you bothered to come to this class, to my class." So that was the start of my journey in life. My parents grew me up and the other siblings to stand up for what you believe in. They protected us. We did not know that we were poor until some white official came along and said, "Oh, you poor black person, you're living in a shanty with dirt floors and no windows, no electricity and all those things." But on reflection, I believe that I was rich in culture, in the love of family, in our language, our peoples, my brothers and sisters, that no government official could take that away. So my richness is still there. The other thing is that I believe that every opportunity by coming to sharing with brothers and sisters of the world, that if we stand together, we understand each other, and we can be an influence to the world. We can change things because we are the intelligence of this earth. Our first peoples of the nation that have survived, particularly in Australia, which I'm very proud of, some 60,000 years. So that is of value to me, enormous value, as I respect the value of you and the audience and your heritage, where your cultures, where you come from. So that exclusion, Pat and others, at that very time in school, it sort of drives you to do something different and to do something to prove to that one person that disbelieved in me, disbelieved in my friend, and disbelieved in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in our schools and our education system. The sad thing is that there is a system in Australia that still believes that we still will amount to nothing. If we have 3% of the population of Australia, there is some enormous amount of money that is invested by the government to address our disadvantage, to address our poverty. So the 3%, of that 3%, the most vulnerable will be less than the 3%. I've done quite well for myself and my family. But there are my brothers, my siblings, are of the poorest. It is very difficult for them to acquire a job, to get an education, to go on to starting a business, to doing other things, because of the institutional racism within that nation itself, the very foundations of the creation of the nation, when the Constitution was created without us as First Peoples, even though we were there, but then to get the attention in probably more than 150 years later. So that exclusiveness is really still there. And to bring us into more recent times, in our role here is saying, we want to be included. We have seen, we have witnessed, on that 3% of the population, there is less people being most vulnerable, yet the amount of money, the amount of investment hasn't changed. But the difference between better health outcomes, the right to shelter, the imprisonment rates is up to 27% of the population in an prison, and that is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples.
So 3% of the population account for 27% of the prison population.
Yes, exactly. So all of these things don't equate to the investments and the feeling good of an institution like the Australian government to say we are doing the right things. Well, it is not right. And I think that one of the reflections in Ben's story about the frog in the pan, it's a very sad story for me, but it's a real story. It's the truth of an elderly man in remote Australia was arrested for driving without a licence. And so he was sentenced to prison for about 6 months. He was in remote Australia, so the prison authorities had to come and collect him in a van. And the van itself, the air conditioning broke. The two drivers were escorting this bloke some hundreds of kilometres, and this elderly person was in the back of the van. So if it was 40 degrees Celsius outside the van, it was even more inside the van. So they travelled for miles and miles and miles. By the time they got to their destination, the elderly man had died. So he basically cooked to death in that van. No one was held to account for that mistake. Not the two drivers, not the company that ran the service, not the government that engaged the service. So these things happen to people within those institutions, whether it's the police force, whether it's the court system, whether it's in a hospital or an education system. The institutional racism there against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples is very much right. But I say that by coming to this to inform you because you may not know the truth of what happens at a local community, as I don't know the truth of what happens in your communities where you live. And the way that I'm informed is generally by public media and actually meeting people.
So what two changes would you introduce, Rod?
So the two changes fundamentally is about rights. The Australian government has signed up, as many nations have signed up, to the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That has come around its 10th year. We still haven't had any action in Australia about how do we work to implement or take actions to implement. Again, there's this exclusiveness. So if there's not action there, we're offering. We're here to help you develop and design something that will see this come to realisation. That is the first thing. The second is that we have called many times on the government, particularly in the last couple of years, to change this constitutional reform that recognises the First Peoples of Australia, to add that, to correct the record of Australian history. And one of those things is to enter into an arrangement or treaty negotiations with the First Peoples of Australia. And as far as I understand, that Australia is the only Commonwealth country in the world that doesn't have a settlement arrangement with its First Peoples. So through the constitutional reform, through those conversations, through that engagement and that inclusiveness is what I'm hoping for, that the Australian government will take that on board and act accordingly and truthfully.
Okay. Thank you, Rob. Our third contribution is CHOGM, and after this, not long after this, we'll be coming to the floor, so start thinking about your questions. Marchu is a campaigner for the rights of women seeking refuge and asylum, and she's the grassroots director for Women for Refugee Women, an organisation, and she's passionate about empowering refugees and asylum-seeking women to speak up and tell their own stories. As part of her work, she's co-authored research reports, delivered training, and helps to maintain women's networks around the country.
Thank you, Pat. I'm going to talk about truth and hard truth, as Ben Okri said. Migration is part of our human history. People move. Currently, there are 65 million refugees on the move, according to a UNHCR report. And out of those 65 million refugees, Britain takes a very small percentage of that. And I guess the question is, how do we treat those refugee and asylum seekers when they come to the UK? Do we treat them with dignity we enable them to live a decent life? And many may think Britain is a country that, that upholds the pillar of human rights, and therefore these refugees will be treated with dignity. But unfortunately, they are not. And I'm just going to stand up for this next part. Okay. But what I want to do is I want to invite everyone in this room to stand up. So I've heard that this room is about 400 people. And I want to tell you now, there are 400 women who are held in immigration detention centre in Bedfordshire, which is called Yarswood Detention Centre, right now. Right now, at this moment in time, there are 400, many of them asylum-seeking women who are held indefinitely in this country. Can I get the first 5 rows to remain standing and the rest to sit down, please? Thank you. You guys can. So I guess this is about 100 or so people. And I just want to say to you, about 3 weeks ago, 120 of those women were on hunger strike because of the conditions that they are experiencing at Yarswood Detention Centre. So I'm just going to go on to tell you a bit more about those conditions. Thank you for participating. So the organisation I'm part of, Women for Refugee Women, and many organisations that work in this sector, we have been campaigning to end detention. Our campaign is called #SetHerFree. And what we are saying is that detention, there's no need to have detention as part of an asylum process. And many countries have processes which are more supportive, and they do not detain asylum seekers. We started this campaign 5 years ago. I've done many research and spoken to many women and have gone to visit them at Yarswood Detention Centre. One woman told me, we may not have come from a war-torn country, but we have come from a war on us. She meant as women, many of the women I speak to are fleeing gender-based violence. They have fled rape, sexual violence, other things like FGM, forced marriages. And they have come to this country to seek safety and sanctuary. However, detention is an administrative process by the Home Office. There is no judicial oversight. These women, there is no limit on the number of days or months people can be detained. It is indefinite, and that policy is only in the UK out of the European countries. You know, we are the only country in Europe who have indefinite detention, which means that someone could be detained and not know when they will be released. And that is the most torturous action, because a person who does not know when they will be released, you know, could you imagine the mental torture that goes on? The other thing, the conditions in detentions, in terms of healthcare, in terms of the depression, the suicidal rates in detention are very high. And essentially, detention does not serve any purpose. 85% of the women we spoke to in our last report were released back into the community. So not only is it indefinite, but the fact that when women are released back into the community, they are unable to integrate because of this traumatic experience that has taken place in their life. So how will they trust institutions? How are they going to integrate back into the community? How are they going to trust the asylum process, which did not believe them in the first place? Yeah, and I guess what I want to say is, in terms of the kind of two changes that we want to see, obviously we are working to end detention. And in the climate that we are in, with Britain, you know, Brexit and immigration being a hot topic, we are asking for pragmatic measures. And one is for a time limit, a 28-day time limit, so that women know when they are coming out. And the second ask is that one thing that, you know, a couple of years ago, is that the government has said that they have this new adults at risk policy, which means that women who they view are at risk, including those who've experienced sexual violence, will not be detained. However, they are not adhering to that policy. So we are asking for some kind of screening process, so that that is in place, so that women can be screened, and if they are deemed to be vulnerable, they are not detained. Thank you.
Okay. So my first question to the panel. So, I mean, I live in this country. I'm a journalist, and I didn't know about the hunger strike at Yarlswood. I certainly hadn't heard this story, and much of what we talked about yesterday and today was totally new to me. In a digital age where you look at the success of campaigns like Black Lives Matter in taking the subject and putting it on everybody's agenda, including people around the world, is there a form of digital activism that maybe your campaigns can adopt to put these issues on the agenda, but also to connect up with like-minded people elsewhere in the Commonwealth?
Well, we have the Set Her Free hashtag, Set Her Free. So if anyone wants to follow and know about this this issue, please do follow us. I think the problem is that those women who are detained are unable to engage digitally because their phones are taken away from them. So they can't really engage in the way that we want them to. But they do tell their stories through different forms. So please do follow.
Well, we've run several campaigns, and we're running, obviously, a very concerted campaign, a digital campaign around CHOGM and the Commonwealth Summit. Our hashtag is hashtag TCEN, T-C-E-N. And, you know, there are other hashtags that we are also using, like Queer Commonwealth, hashtag Queer Commonwealth. You'll find that we are doing a lot of campaigning and digital media around the issues. I'm glad that we have a really great team of people And we've realized, the LGBT community has realized that, you know, digital campaigning is very important, as well as, you know, mainstream media campaigning. So we're doing all of it. And we do all of it in Sri Lanka as well for the stuff that's going on there.
Okay.
In Australia, we have a campaign called Close the Gap, and the Close the Gap campaign is designed to close the gap on all the social indicators. And in the last 10 years, the government's approach has been closing the gap strategy, which has failed in many of the target areas. So the people themselves, our people ourselves, we launched a campaign called the Red Fern Statement, which is drawn on some inspirational speech by our former Prime Minister. And that campaign says that the Red Fern Statement is claiming that we have the solutions in our community, and we need to be engaged in the design, development, implementation and evaluation of the programs that are intended to benefit our peoples. That Red Fern Statement is one of that has got great support universally from our communities, but it has fantastic civil society support. I spent a week with the Black Lives Matter founders, and they won the Sydney Peace Prize in Australia, and it is enormous how the feelings that we have between each other and the experiences that we have is that people who are most targeted, most vulnerable, the rest of society or the system, the governments, actually use that as a demonstration or the feel-good about doing things for the right reasons, when in fact it's not having the effect that we believe it can have.
Do you think more needs to be done to dramatise the situation, to make it real, to put it front and centre?
I think what you said you live in this country and you weren't aware about what is happening to women asylum seekers, what's happening in Yarlswood, in our own backyard, and that's essentially the problem, that this issue is not picked up by the mainstream media, or how do we get these stories across, and how do we make change happen? Because I think that's really important.
I think in Sri Lanka, for example, I mean, digital media is not the only vehicle to use, because there are loads of people, like probably up to 60% of the people in rural areas don't have access to computers and mobile phones, Android mobile phones. So we depend a lot on mainstream news media. And in the past, the news media has been extremely hostile and very homophobic. But in the last 3 years, we've managed to turn things around. We've sensitized media. And I think this is very important, that media be sensitized, because all media houses have an editor's code of ethics and all of that. But that goes right out the window when they want to sensationalize something and vilify a certain group of people. But talking to them and sensitizing them is very important, and we've managed to now get the media on our side in the last 2-3 years. But don't forget, with governments, it's very difficult. The previous government that we had actually controlled all of the media houses. So they were only able to write what was sanctioned by the government. At least with this government, there is no control over the media, and we can get stuff out there. So it depends on situations.
Yeah, and I think, Pat, that it depends on the well-beings, I guess, and the people who run these media outlets. I think digitisation has two opportunities. One is an opportunity to sustain the negatives and keep presenting the untruths. But it also is an opportunity to tell the truth on many things. But we know in societies that there is a lot of unconditioning to do for people to be more informed, to make their own choices, and to decide what they might take of some information. When you have plenty of racism in a society. We only just in the last month had a commercial television station in Australia talk about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander matters. Only in a month ago, in 2018. But they sensationalised the stolen generations, if you like, encouraging the migration of white African refugees to take Aboriginal children, to adopt Aboriginal children.
This is the next thing. This is the inviting white South African farmers to come to Australia and adopt Aboriginal children as well.
Yes. Because that's where they're going.
Get your head around that.
And yeah, exactly. Get your head around that. But even in a technology that we have today, there are many stories, but there are many people who will draw on the habits, I guess, or the instilled racism or prejudice that they may hold.
What role can money
draw on the habits, I guess, or the instilled racism or prejudice that they may hold?
What role can money play? So, Commonwealth countries desperate for EU funds, desperate for DFID. You're all going to be offered brand new post-Brexit special deals. What leverage could you use there to try and... Because, I mean, these are standard clauses. If you are tendering for business within the UK or the EU, you'll have all the boxes you need to tick around equality and diversity, even making progress with the BBC. I have to tick boxes. So why wouldn't that become part of an aid programme or an EU funding programme going forward?
So just to say about the money, currently the UK government spends £118 million to run detention centres, and that amounts to £40,000 per woman per year.
Wow.
Which is a huge amount of money. And so what we're saying with the policy recommendations that we have is, we want to save the government some money. And, it being austerity, you think they would listen to us, but no. So what we're saying, we need to move away from detention centres as an answer to an immigration process. It's not an answer, and it doesn't solve any problems. And so by moving away from detention centres and having a more supportive asylum process for anyone who comes to this country to seek safety and sanctuary, we can save money.
It's an extremely sensitive issue in the sense that most governments don't like to be told by the UK or the US or whatever what they should be doing in their own countries. But at the same time, if they're accepting, huge amounts of funds to do various infrastructure development and so on, those funds definitely must have some kind of conditions attached to it. Because why on earth would a country want to give funds to another country where people are just being violated left, right, and center, and you are just exacerbating the situation? I mean, in my country, there's a lot of corruption. So how much money really do the people of my country see, and how much money goes into the pockets of the politicians? So we need to find a way to stop this nonsense, and knowing that there is this issue, I think there has to be safeguards against using funding, like say from DFID, for example. It's the UK people's funds. The people need to be able to tell the government where those funds go and how it's used. I certainly, if I was living in the UK, I certainly wouldn't want, my tax money going to a government that is, bullying and violating people's rights and robbing the money and having big Swiss bank accounts.
And Pat, I think that Rosanna has put on a really, really important point about where the money doesn't hit the ground. So if we're 3% of the population and There's been government investments, something like $33 billion, going to address Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander disadvantage. Now, if those funds were actually getting to the people on the ground and that they were delivering the services, then you wouldn't have that less than 3% being disadvantaged. So if you can do the very sums of $33 billion for 3% or less than 3% of the disadvantaged, then there should be no, I guess, social indicators that really needs to be addressed. Closing the gap on health, life expectancy and those kinds of...
Devising and executing
Absolutely.
the plans.
Absolutely, and that's what we're...
So there it's not about the money, it's about how the money's being
That's right.
applied.
And that's what the Redfern statement, as I said, is why the call to action on government is to have a better engagement with us, enable us to design, develop, implement and evaluate the impact of that investment. And what we are confronted with is the same old approach. So the same old approach is, we've got the money, we'll throw the money at this problem.
So what's the argument against what you're putting forward, which seems quite...
Well, they just still want to be in control.
Right, so it's about control.
It's about control.
And if you're 3% of the population, it's...
Yeah.
It's not going to be a coup. I mean, it's hard to get control if you're 3%. So it's going to be coalitions and alliances and...
Yeah. Well, the coalitions are so important with civil society is that we have Chinese population in Australia, which is 5%. And the other multicultural communities is growing. So, and our population, there is a mood in Australia that because of the lighter the skin you are, the less claim that you have to be Aboriginal. Because the claim is to be Aboriginal is only that you want the access to the money,
Right.
which is false. 3 cases in Australia have been about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's identity, and exactly why we want the implementation of the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, for us to have the freedom to identify and to develop our own solutions for our own matters. And I think that is the challenge for the system, to let control go.
Giving up control.
We might, yeah.
Okay, we're going to come out to the floor. So questions.
Oh, look at all that.
There's a gentleman there and then a lady here. So, gentlemen, just wait for a microphone. Please stand, but there'll be a microphone just coming to you. Oh, there's some questions behind me. That's very helpful. They're down there as well if I put my glasses on. Okay, so off you go.
Yes, first of all, presumably we can broaden this discussion from just the elements we've been talking
Absolutely.
about here to other forms of exclusion in the Commonwealth.
Yep.
Yes, my name is John Duffy. I'm from Antigua and Barbuda. But I'm actually here on an issue that I would doubt anybody in this room is aware of. There are about 13 million British pensioners around the world, most of them living in the UK, some in Europe and so on. Of the pensioners living in the UK, Europe, the US, the Philippines, Israel, Mauritius, a few other places, they get their pensions increased with inflation every year. There are 500,000 British pensioners living in the Commonwealth who are excluded from this increase every year. Some of them now absolutely living in poverty. This is a deliberate action by the British government every single year. They vote to exclude British pensioners. Now, we have been campaigning for years to get this corrected. A couple of years ago, an elderly lady died in Australia on a pension of £6.12 a week.
Wow.
There are many, many British pensioners, many of whom fought in the war, who are on less than half the standard pension. Now, my question, since this was a question, my question is, what is this forum, what are the peoples of the Commonwealth going to say to the Commonwealth leaders and to the British government about these excluded British pensioners?
Anybody here think that it's acceptable? Because otherwise the message can be, it's not acceptable. I think that's the message. It's not acceptable.
Yep, agreed.
We need to do something about it.
Yeah. This forum these questions will be taken into other fora, but I think the mood from the room is,
Yep.
one, it's news to most of us, and two, it certainly isn't acceptable. My dad's a pensioner in Barbados, so...
Many people who moved to the UK from Commonwealth countries or former colonies now can't move back because, I mean, particularly this is true in the Caribbean.
Yeah.
They can't move back because they're going to be on a diminished income.
Yeah.
And what's so crazy, I mean, Jamaica and Barbados are not excluded. They get their pensions rated every year. The French islands, the Dutch islands in the Caribbean get their pensions increased. The former British colonies and even the British territories that still exist there don't. Australia, Canada, they don't get their pensions increased. The whole of Africa.
No, it sounds like a scandal. Next question. There was a lady here. Just wait for the paddle. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. I'm still trying to get my head around many submissions right from the beginning, including the poetry performance, which told us that the wealth that we share in common is basically our humanity, our common humanity. I come from Pakistan. We are 200 million people. I am neighbors to one of the most populous countries in the world, that is India, and then there is China. 3 submissions that were made here today, very important. I listened very carefully. I worry that when we talk about exclusion, sometimes when the issue becomes marginal, not only because there are conceptual differences in how we see each other, how we perceive the other, but because we are smaller numbers, and therefore we are minorities and not powerful and don't have the voice that is required, then where is the submission that was made by Ben Okri when he talked about the secret will of the magnification of the human being? And I'd like to actually co-opt that and say that it is not just the magnification, it is the magnificence of the human being, whether small in numbers, small in size, but the issue is always huge. The issue is that of exclusion, and the need is that of inclusion. How do we then go beyond the fact that the exclusion is of people who are in smaller numbers, but who have exactly the same needs and the same rights? How do we then empower ourselves regardless of the fact that we are so seen as smaller and yet we see ourselves as the same?
Okay, I'm going to ask Rosanna to answer that. In the context of this network that you've created across the Commonwealth, which seems to be certainly trying to create some sort of scale.
You know, it's not an easy thing to do, particularly coming from countries such as ours that, marginalize the LGBT community. And I know in Pakistan it's horrendous. But I think that the way to do it is intersectionality, to talk with other groups and other marginalized communities, to get together with those people. Where the LGBTIQ community is concerned, the movement is a global movement. It is not just within our countries only. It is all over the world, because there are LGBTIQ persons in every single country, in every single strata of life, in every single profession, everywhere. Poor, rich, from Muslim communities, Christian communities, you name it, we are everywhere. So it is a global movement. And while we are small voices in our own countries, when we get together, we become big voices. So I think the thing to do is to try and find a way to make a big noise, to find a bigger voice by maybe getting allies on board. The LGBT community does not rely only on LGBT persons. We have some amazing allies on board as well, heterosexual allies that help us in numerous ways. And I'm of this opinion that, every single movement has to include everybody. Exclusion is not an option.
Okay, gentleman there in the green, and then there's a lady over here in the black.
Clive Lawton from the Commonwealth Jewish Council. First of all, I'm very pleased we have affiliates from each of the countries on the on the platform from Sri Lanka. You're not quite Barbados, but nevertheless that too, and Australia and the UK. It seems to me that from the presentations of the panel, we've been presented with significant examples of injustice, without doubt. But I would want to distinguish between them in a way, because the situation of the LGBTIQ community in Sri Lanka and in other countries is a simple injustice. And people should be treated non-discriminatorily by their legal systems, and that has to be corrected. It seems pretty obvious to me. In the situation of First Nations, it's frequently something more to do with inequity rather than simple inequality. Something about finding ways to enable opportunities to enter, empowering, recognizing, those kinds of things in the history of people. And these are things that single countries can do for their own citizens. It's a scandal if it doesn't happen. As I have to say, as a Jewish community also, we feel like we're a kind of First Nations in some ways too. But the situation of migrants, while that can be resolved country by country, and Marchu makes a strong argument for what happens in the UK, it seems to me that's particularly the Commonwealth's business, because the Commonwealth purports to be a community of nations. The Jews, again, are past masters at refugee ship. And there are very, very few Jews in the world who could claim to be more than 6 generations in the country in which they live. They've been moved around all the time. And as an international community, the Commonwealth community seems to me to be very importantly placed to think about how it accommodates and responds to people from outside of the countries in which they are. So this is not merely how do we deal with our own citizens. We ought to expect every country in the Commonwealth to deal decently with its own citizens and fairly and justly and so forth. But this is about how do we respond to the business of people coming from outside of our national boundaries. And if the Commonwealth is merely a collection of closed countries that manages its own people but doesn't really relate to other people's people, it seems to me that it's failing entirely to live up to its highest possibilities. And so I would hope that from this People's Forum, a strong challenge, strong demand goes to the heads of government, that they exceptionally stand up for a system of responding to refugees and asylum seekers and migrants, which sets an example to the rest of the communities of the world, that the Commonwealth in particular should be an outstanding place in which refugees and migrants are decently treated and received. Because it is in fact a no-brainer. We all know that migrants to countries turn out to be of benefit to those countries. Frequently the most energetic, the most committed, the most engaged, the most creative. And that, as a Commonwealth People's Forum, given the tendency to exploit populist counter voices, as a Commonwealth People's Forum, we should be demanding of our heads of government.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
There's a lady just here.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello?
Yeah.
Okay. My name is Tendai Commander. I work for an organization called Triumph Africa. And I just wanted to echo something that you said, Patrick, at the beginning. You referred to the Windrush generation. And I think someone else mentioned about older people. And just wanted to say, as the People's Forum, I'm glad to see so many older people here. The Commonwealth this year, for the first time, is running an Elders Forum, which had a fee attached to it. So when we're talking about exclusion, I'd like to put it to the Commonwealth that you have actively excluded older people by putting a fee on the Elders Forum. Also, I think something that is in common across the issues that we're discussing here is age. Whether it's LGBTIQ, whether it's women refugees or indigenous people, that it's older people. And I'm from Africa originally, and the issue in Africa about older people and investing in older people seems to be somehow at odds with investing in the youth. And I'd put it to the Commonwealth that investing in infrastructure and support for older people is not to say a drain on resources. I think some of the words that you were said on the panel were people being treated as though they're invisible, as though they're a strain and acknowledging the elephant in the room. And I'd put it to you that that is actually older people that we are treating that way.
Okay. Any contribution on older people? I mean, clearly very important in the Aboriginal tradition. Age is venerated.
Well, that's right. And I think that older peoples in my community don't actually reach that age to access their pension or their superannuation. We are having conversations already about, so if that person doesn't meet its mature age to access their superannuation or their pension, that their families would have access, and they are being denied that access because of not having a birth certificate or not having identification. But they have worked, contribute to, but as the gentleman said, also served in a conflict for the nation that's their country. But it's one of those difficult things where I was in a conversation about the preservation of quality of life is what your pension and your superannuation contributes to. But if for first persons in Australia, you can't access it because your life expectancy doesn't reach that. And so they said you can't be different to the rest of the nation to access that money. But it seems to be about equality on that stipulation about the age rather than preservation of life or, you know, how to live your life. So these are some of the things that are wrong. In terms of the other question about how do we do this, certainly I have talked about not disrespecting older persons, but to prepare for the next round of older persons, is that the National Congress has been engaged. I certainly have been engaged with the International Global Youth Caucus, which is networking with younger people to prepare for the future. And that is so important because the future will come around very quickly. And so that preparation, not forgetting our older persons and the contributions they've made to society, valuing that and supporting that.
Future starts tomorrow.
Yes.
There is a question, a couple of questions on religion. I'm just going to take one. What role does religion play in increasing or decreasing inclusion?
I think
answer while I'm just looking to see the next one.
I think religion plays a huge role in decreasing inclusion, because I think where LGBTIQ persons are concerned, I mean, most religions condemn them. Sri Lanka, as a Buddhist country, unfortunately, has suddenly decided that they are going to go ultra extremist about everything. So by deeming LGBT as a Western import, they try to say that, you know, it's not part of a Buddhist culture. So yeah, I think religions play a huge role in excluding people and also marginalizing people in a great way.
Can they play another role? You think of the role Tutu played with Inter Africa. It doesn't have to be. Are there ways that you can engage them as part of the greater good?
Yeah, well, there are some religions like, the Anglican Church or the Episcopalian Church in the United States, for example, that embraces LGBT and diversity and, women priests and so on. I think most, organizational religions that have a very patriarchal kind of hierarchy, you are going to find various ways in which these religions try to undermine people and who they are.
Marshall?
In regards to religion?
In regard to religion, yeah.
Anyone could be a refugee. So whether you're, Muslim, Christian, the gentleman over there talked about the history of the Jews. So I think it's, regardless of what religion, and the detention centre I spoke to you guys about, Yarswood Detention Centre, there are many women from the Commonwealth who are being detained under such conditions. And in fact, one of the women who I spoke to said to me, it's not what happened to me in my home country that broke me, but what happened to me here. So it's really looking at, I do agree that we need to have laws and procedures that go beyond borders, because people are moving across countries to seek safety and sanctuary. And one of the important things about looking at how we treat the most vulnerable in our communities, in our country, is, someone said that, how we treat asylum seekers is how the government will treat us if they can get away with it. So it's about holding the line of decency, of dignity for all of us, because the laws that exist, if they are allowed to be eroded away for exceptions or for excluding groups of people, then what hope is there for all of us?
Pat, if I could just add just quickly, from all religions and all faiths, the intent of spirituality and acceptance and goodness is what I think that all religions can contribute to accept all peoples in society. That is a massive movement, a massive thing where people will do things for the good of society. That's the biggest role that I think they can play.
Tapping into what Ben was saying earlier.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to take 3 more questions. There's a gentleman there, and then I'll look at the time. Don't worry, I'm not going to stop there. Gentleman there.
Colin Saldana from Canada. I just want to say that I want to compliment Min and Vijay for initiating, but we need to take this discussion to some practical perspective discussion. We've had a lot on these international forums, but I think the practicality has to be implemented. In Canada, we're doing much more on the refugee issue, taking larger numbers. Gender equality is on the agenda, and working with the Indigenous people has gone to new heights. The point that I really want to make is about that it won't be long before you have another chair on the podium, and that's about persecution of religious minorities in the Commonwealth. Yep. I think this is a serious issue that's taking place. It's entrenched in some countries' constitution. This is unacceptable. People are dying from it. Sometimes simple things. If one person drinks from another person's glass, they can be ostracized, etc. So I think it's something that we need to take. Now, these issues that we've raised here today, I believe have to be held in sessions for the heads of government to make them speak specifically to this, as opposed to buried under the general human rights initiatives. If we were to pick up 3 or 4 topics, whether it be Indigenous, whether it be LGBTQ, or whether it be religious minority issues, and if the heads of government were to address those particular issues. Secondly, I think there should be a status report when this is given out. I would be interested in knowing what the status report of the recommendations that came out of the Malta Agreement, from a specific point of view, what was done. Otherwise, talk for the sake of talk will get us nowhere. So religious minorities issues, I think, should be another issue that at some point should be addressed. Thank you.
I'd also say that Canada shows what happens when you have leadership at a national level. Yeah. Canada's moved very quickly on a number of things under Trudeau. Gentleman there.
Thank you. My name is Alan Maleche. I'm from Kenya. I'm a health and human rights lawyer working on issues of health in Kenya with an organization called KELIN. My question goes to Rosanna, but also a recommendation to the Commonwealth Foundation in terms of, we know it's been 50 years since England decriminalized same-sex relations, but we still have about 72 countries globally that still have these laws on the book. So in your view, where would be the best place to put pressure? Is it on ministers? Is it on parliamentarians? Is the focus on judges to be able to strike down the laws? And linking this to the Commonwealth Forum, I know we do have a forum for judges and magistrates. We have a forum for ministers of health. We have a forum for parliamentarians. Based on what the gentleman from Canada said, are these topics the Commonwealth would put on the table for these particular groups of people? And lastly, the gay community in Kenya is actually challenging one of those laws we unfortunately inherited from England, and hopefully the court will make a decision this year on whether that gets off the book or not. Thank you.
Actually, there's 36 countries still that criminalize homosexuality in the Commonwealth. And yeah, it is a legacy of colonial Britain, but putting pressure on countries is sometimes very difficult. It's a diplomatic nightmare. I remember when after the CHOGM in 2011 in Perth, I believe, David Cameron said something about withholding developmental aid to countries that still criminalize homosexuality. And my government went crazy, yeah. So we have to be very careful as to how the pressure is applied on governments to make changes in countries. It can also be very dangerous for the activists and the people within that in that country if something is pushed that that country doesn't particularly care to. I mean, for example, I've heard that if there is any mention of LGBT, some African countries might walk out of the Commonwealth CHOGM heads of government meeting. So it is a very sensitive issue. For us, it's not sensitive. These are our lives, obviously. But governments don't like to hear from other governments what they should be doing in their own country. Having said that,
on a broad philosophical point,
on a broad
they're all signed up to the Commonwealth Charter.
that was what I was going
They're
to
all
say.
signed up to the UN Charter.
Yeah.
If they don't want to implement them, why should they be in the club?
Well, and my contention is hit them where it hurts the most, in their pockets. If they are wanting to get, developmental funding from the UK, then they must adhere to the Commonwealth Charter.
Okay, there's a gentleman over there.
Yes, hello. My name is Asoko Besekar from Transparency International Sri Lanka. My question is for Rob. You spoke about the wealth of your culture and language, and it's clear how, given the circumstances in your youth, how that was a pillar of strength for you. My question is, if we were to flip that, and let's say when we look at majority communities, and when majority communities, if we look at sometimes those who are not economically empowered within majority communities, when they celebrate things to do with their culture, amongst other things, sometimes in liberal spaces that is viewed as being sort of feeding into a nationalist narrative. Do you see an issue there in the way in which when minority communities celebrate particular things, when majority communities try to celebrate those things, the issues that emanate from that, and in light of that, how should majority communities sort of conduct themselves in your opinion?
That's a very pertinent question there, because the biggest debate in Australia is around the celebration of Australia Day. Historically, it says this was the day that Australia was invaded, from my perspective, but for other Australians, it was the creation of a nation. But it excluded us. It excluded my ancestors. So that debate continues, where that, I've had some international conversations about this, is that where the nation, the majority, and their privilege is to be imposed on those of the minority, and that their celebrations and their identity is not recognised or valued. That there has to be an acceptance that First Peoples has to accept this historical date as the date of the creation of a nation, when for my people, my ancestors, it's much longer than that, and that's of the value to me, not the arrival of James Cook to come and take over the nation, to say that there was no one living here where there was my ancestors. So that's a very real debate in our country. There's been lots of attempts, and particularly around reconciliation of the nation, and through recognition and all kinds of feel-good approaches. But I think what gets in the way is a particular privilege that is from the majority onto the minority, to say that you have to celebrate with us, to celebrate all things that are great for this nation. I certainly don't celebrate the tampering of the cricket. You know, so that is one thing. I don't like cricket, but I think that is a national embarrassment. But the debate on when to celebrate history in the nation, but to find somewhere that we can celebrate together is often a hard thing for the majority to have that conversation and to value our existence and our very own history and our heritage.
What I find surprising is how different it is, say, in New Zealand to Australia.
Yep.
New Zealand even have their national anthem, Maori first,
Yep.
English second, and you'd never get that in Australia.
No.
No, that wouldn't happen.
In most places.
In most
true,
places.
even in England.
Yeah.
We got time for one more question. So there was a gentleman, sorry, but there was a gentleman down here I recognised earlier, just here in the middle here. Just put your hand up, sir. And this will be our last question.
Yeah, hi. My name is Pritz Dulay. I come from South Africa. I come from also the Biko generation. I'm looking at the word Commonwealth there, and I think I'm old enough now to begin to question these things. Yeah. This is my first visit to Westminster, and I see a lot of wealth there. I just wonder where a lot of that wealth came from. So out of the 53 nations, 52 of them had their wealth removed, and we were left with the commonness of that stealing. We also have another problem in that not only was the wealth stolen from many of these countries, the countries themselves were stolen. Australia, New Zealand, all range of countries. South Africa, enormous amounts of wealth were taken from India, you name it. We've got to start asking critical questions. My middle name, by the way, is Troublemaker. We're going to start asking questions such as, when is Britain going to Brexit the Commonwealth? Because really, she's the mother of exclusion and continues to remain the mother of exclusions. If you take what is going on right now, the excluding of people of colour who've lived in Britain for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, what is that? Isn't that exclusion?
Yeah.
Question to the panel. Take it up. Thank you.
Wow.
I think I have the same middle name as you. I agree with you wholeheartedly. I mean, the amount of wealth that was stolen from all our countries. And, Britain has to take responsibility for some of the, issues that they have created by being there in the first place, such as, half our penal codes, which, by the way, not only, criminalizes LGBTIQ, but it disallows women to buy alcohol, for example. Where did that come from? I thought the British loved their G&T. How come they exclude, women
India.
from buying their
India.
G&T? I mean, for heaven's sakes. But, these are, past laws that we've inherited, which, unfortunately, basically excludes various groups of people. And, I think the UK needs to take responsibility for that somehow. I don't know about exiting the Commonwealth, though. Maybe the Commonwealth needs to, I don't know. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, the point you made about this exclusion still happening, is still happening. And the women in Yarlswood, many of them, as I said, are from the Commonwealth. Many of them are women of colour, black women, African women. There's no white women being held in this detention centre. So, and the racism and the abuse that goes on there is a microcosm this bigger institution and this this hierarchy that still exists in this country and across the world.
Okay, it's time to wrap. Mr. G is going to come and ask you a poll question.
Yeah,
Then I will thank the panel.
I can see already you guys have been engaging into the conversation. For those of you that haven't, if you could just use the polling app Glisser, put that into your URL and click on to inside the margins, and we're going to ask a question for the poll, which is, what institutional change is needed in the Commonwealth to ensure that exclusion is effectively challenged? What institutional change is needed in the Commonwealth to ensure that exclusion is effectively challenged? Okay, we've got less power in the UK, more accountability, legislative reform, honesty. Transparency and governance. Accountable institutions. Wow, I can see this has got real democracy, leadership, and see what you guys have started. Yeah, amazing stuff. Anyway,
Okay.
can I give a big round of applause to the panel? Patrick Young, Rosanna Flamer Calderon, Marchu Gurma, and Rod Little.